your attention. We're going to get started here at our second keynote, and I have a little bit of introduction here for our speakers. The first passage of the 6 scriptures that Guru Granth Sahib reads in translation. First, God created light. All humanity has been created by the same divine. All have been created out of the same light. How could one be good and another bad? And the teachings of the Gurus from Guru Nanak until the appointment of these scriptures as the eternal Guru for Sikhs point clearly and inexorably to this understanding for Sikhism's inheritance that God permeates us all, we're all part of the one divine. This was challenged on August 5th, 2012, when a person heavily involved in the White Power movement entered the Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek, killing 6 people and wounding 4 others. This event shocked the nation, as back then we were unaccustomed to mass shootings happening at places of worship. The Sikh community could have turned inward, but they did not. They courageously opened their doors for Langar, and people flooded in to demonstrate solidarity. The Sikh community of Greater Milwaukee has shown us again and again what a belief in our essential human oneness looks like, and that witness has led to a general strengthening of ties among our interfaith community in the Greater Milwaukee area. The friendship and working relationship between Pardeep Singh Kaleka, the son of one of the victims, and Arno Michaelis, a former white nationalist, is a phoenix that has arisen from the ashes of this horrific event. Over the last several years, Pardeep and I have worked together extensively as respectively the executive director and chair of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee. He's moved on to doing many different things, but among them being a co-director of the nonprofit Not in Our Town, a movement to stop hate, address bullying, and build safe, inclusive communities for all. The presentation you're about to hear from Arno and Pardeep is truly an example of how hope can triumph over hate. And I'm delighted to get to present to you Arno Michaelis and Pardeep Kaleka.
Thank you so much, Reverend Simmons. Thank you all. The love is mutual, and I thank you for spreading your light and seeing the good, and sometimes those people that don't see it in themselves, and nurturing that good in our society. As David was reading the verse from the Guru Granth Sahib, as in there is no good in myself and no bad in myself, but it is what I nurture. And as we recognize that light in ourselves, we have the ability to nurture that light in others. And I have been blessed to be the executive director of the Interfaith Conference and know many of you personally and get to know and recognize that light, and selfishly over the past 11 years have been able to utilize that. So always understand that whether we are giving advice, whether we are talking with someone, or whether we're just there and we listen to that person, is that has always been felt. And David talked about a shooting that happened almost 11 years ago now. It feels, sometimes time feels like it's gone by fast, and sometimes it feels like it goes by slow. But as I reflect here, I feel like it's gone by fast, and Arno and I are just a little bit older than we were 10 years ago, 11 years ago. But I mean, during that time, we have never, ever, ever felt alone. And that is a testament to our living God that connects us all, to our working God who connects us all. And I know that it is in this spirit that you are all gathered for these next couple of days, these last couple of days, and to really take that, utilize this time, and go out into the world and know that sometimes you may feel alone, sometimes you may feel like, why am I doing this? Am I ever getting anywhere, right? But you are, and sometimes it's unspoken, it's sometimes you don't get to sit up here and have a talk or a keynote, but know that we Arno and I both celebrate all of you and the work that you do. For me, I was thinking about how to kind of start off this conversation today. And I was reading some of the books and just skimming over like kind of how we build inclusive communities, where there is or is not representation, what can we all do about it? And it took me back to a conversation that Arnold and I had in person for the first time, where we first actually met in person. And this was shortly after the shooting happened. And we were working for an organization. The organization, why I was working for it was because I had a history working with at-risk youth in Milwaukee. And we wanted to know kind of the vulnerabilities of at-risk youth to get involved in extremism. And Arnold was working for the same organization in London, and in a different capacity, and he's going to talk over like his capacity and how he was working for them. But for the first time we met, we connected through that kind of, what was it called, like
Against Violent Extremism Network.
Yeah, Against Violent Extremism Network. It was kind of a think tank, right? And this think tank brought people together, which were known as formers and survivors of extremism all around the world. And some of the most heroic stories of people who had been hit by conflict, impacted by conflict, had come together in what they thought would be reconciliation, would be progress work in the capacity that they knew. And once we kind of were introduced there, this was a few months after the shooting, and there's a part of us as a community, we were kind of understanding the reality of where we were. And because of that reality, a fatigue that came about. And a lot of times when we're doing some of this work, there is a fatigue that happens, and we have to just be honest with it, right? It's like, and some of that becomes after the conference is over, right? David, everybody that's been planning this conference, there's such an energy. And then all of a sudden, everybody goes home. You're all gonna feel this. And there's gonna be a fatigue, and there's gonna be this feeling of, I feel like I'm just alone, right? As much as I feel connected now, I feel all alone. And when I reached out to Arno, it wasn't exactly for the sense of loneliness or connection. I reached out to Arno because I wanted answers to why a white supremacist killed 7 people at a good one. I wanted answers, explanation, because the shooter also killed himself. And with him went what I thought would be the answers. And again, we think that that person who impacted or harmed us is going to have the answers. Not always true. There's a lot of answers that are hidden deep in us that we need to bring out. But I thought Arnold would have these answers of why the shooter did this and why he came that day and why us. So when I reached out to him, we did the whole like sort of online dating thing. I don't know if anybody's taken online dates, right? You email a few times and then you swipe right, they swipe right, they show up in your sort of algorithm of, yeah, like I'm interested in you, you're interested in me. Okay, let's have it's a match. Sometimes you accidentally swipe right. And then you gotta take that swipe right back, and that's an uncomfortable feeling. You're like, oh, how am I gonna take this back? I did swipe right, but I accidentally swiped right. We didn't accidentally swipe right, we purposely swiped right. And as we started to communicate a bit more online, at some point we just said, let's just meet up. Let's like really meet each other, like we're meeting each other now. Because nothing replaces this. All of that other stuff, great, but nothing replaces this. There is a hunger deep within us. And I know that there's a lot of reservation and fear and worry about whether people will come back, whether people will connect again. I promise to you, with deep within who we are as human beings, there's a need to connect at a very authentic level. That need was within us as well. And so we met out. And in the entire time, I had this history of, here's this white supremacist, Here's what they look like, here's what they act like, here's what they believe, right? And I have my own reservations. Just a few months ago, a guy that belonged to the organization that Arnold helped to found in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had just carried out one of the deadliest hate crimes committed in a religious place of worship in nearly 50 years. And sadly to say, since 2012, this has happened over and over again. But at that time, it was unheard of. It was unheard of. And so when we finally decided to meet out, I had my own fears. And those fears were, do people like this ever really change? Do racists ever really change? Now, with everybody here, you know, we're 10 years older. I would love to say that I'm gonna look this handsome for the rest of my life. But you all know that we're gonna change, right? We're gonna change, and we gotta navigate that change. One of the certainties in life are that things change. And that's why this journey is so beautiful. But people were telling me, I was telling myself, and the first conversation that I kind of had with Arno, I was judging for it. And so sometimes, even in those communities that are marginalized, that are hurt, there's a pain. And that's a pain that we own. That is a pain that lots of communities own, to say, yes, like, you're not the only one that may have biases, that may have understandings, prejudices. Mine are informed by this pain that I feel because I don't see a lot of representation of myself in power structures, in books, right? In other things. So we may be informed by different places, but the human mind works in a place that we start to understand and say, how is my mind and how is it corrupted by the biases that I have? That time when Arnold and I were talking, I'm like, hey, where do you want to meet out to eat? And he tells me a Thai restaurant. And now I have this sort of understanding of white people in my mind. And a white supremacist, I was like, okay, if he is still a white supremacist, white people can barely handle spicy food. If he's still a white supremacist, right, he wouldn't go to a Thai restaurant where that's all that's on the menu is spicy food. So I was relieved, right? I was like, oh, okay, thank God. And that kept happening over, and that part of our first sort of conversations were really testing the waters of and then moving forward. Another example of that was when we first made it to the restaurant, and right outside the restaurant, I'm sitting out there, and I'm like, okay, I could use the whole excuse. And how many have we got parents in here? Any parents? Okay. How many parents have used the excuse of my kids are sick to not show up at something? That's an uncomfortable laughter.
If they were.
Yeah, if they were.
If they were.
If they were, yeah. Sometimes they get sick, and it's subjective of how sick they are. For sure.
They're running temperatures and all of that stuff, yeah.
Yeah. But my kids were not sick.
Oh.
But I was about to use that excuse because I was scared. I was like, oh, I'm gonna go meet this man, and this is what and then everybody's telling me that, racists don't change, and now I'm starting to believe them. Even my mom is telling me, she's like, what's going on? Here's what you're gonna do. My wife is telling me, are you crazy? And then some that starts to creep in. Fear can be very, very communal. Anxiety can be very, very communal. What's happening in the United States is that fear, paranoia, anxiety is spreading at such a mass level, right? And we are the people that are the remedy to that. So I had to check myself looking at the car, the vehicle that I was in, putting into drive, and then comes, again, when you get to this place and you start to search for something, sometimes the search finds you. And I felt this gentle push forward of Party, you have come this far. It's been a difficult couple of months. You've had to try to lift up an entire community, as well as heal, as well as grieve, as well as all kinds of things. Don't stop here. And that pushed me right into the restaurant, where I saw Arnold standing. And I saw him standing next to two waitresses. And one of the first questions that Arnold asked me, right, I got all these, what am I gonna say to him? What is he gonna say to me? Is it gonna be good enough? And we all have like we all go through that, no matter how wise, smart, we are. Or am I good enough to be here for this person? Right? And so we try, we do our best. The first question that he asked me was,
dude, what happened to your eye? I was going into this like very nervous, very intimidated. I don't know what I'm gonna say to this guy. Like, hey, I'm Arno. Sorry about your dad. Like, just nothing seemed like it would be remotely adequate. And so I'm in there, and I am talking to my friends King and Mary, the servers there, who are both Asian, go figure. Party was also kind of surprised I hadn't ate them at that point. He later told me. But I'm trying to lay down and talk to my friends and just get ready to meet this guy. And he comes walking in, and you see my man here, he's kind of a jock still. This is guy, people still get him on their rec league basketball teams as the ringer. He's always been in pretty good shape, and so he comes walking into this Thai restaurant, and he's pretty buff, and he's got this piece of athletic tape above his eye. It's kind of like this. And I don't get into rough stuff anymore myself, but I still like MMA, UFC, things like that. And the first thing I'm thinking is he looked like a fighter with his eye taped up. And so instead of saying, hey, I'm Arno, how you doing? I'm like, dude, what happened to your eye? Did you get in a brawl or something? And he goes on to tell me about this freak accident that happened the week before. And I really appreciate that he's allowing me to tell this story, because we kind of traded off. It's our favorite story. And every talk we do, like, one of us gets to say it, and the other one, I think I owe you a couple.
yeah.
This is how much he loves me, is that he lets me tell the Knock 'em Dead
Well,
story.
I know some of the audience.
Okay, there you go. So apparently a week earlier, prior to our meeting, he's given his young son and daughter a bath. And his son was 4, his daughter was 7. And his daughter was getting in this state to go through. When children are really tiny and they're toddlers, they don't care about being naked. It's like the Garden of Eden. They run around naked. They don't have any self-consciousness. But Amorous was starting to develop that self-consciousness. And as Party's given her and Jay a bath, Amorous is like, Dad, don't look at me when I'm naked. And so Party, being a father to a daughter, as I am, anyone who's a father to a daughter knows whatever that daughter wants, she's going to get. No matter what kind of mountains you have to move to make it happen. So Party's trying to bathe his daughter without looking at her. And he has to keep peeking over every once in a while to make sure he's getting everywhere, otherwise his wife's going to let him have it. And so he's scrub, peek. And as he looks away once, there's this shower organizer in the corner of the tub. One of these spring-loaded deals.
Yeah.
Goes to the ceiling, the tub top has little shelves. This particular one had little hooks hanging from it, where you could hang a loofah or something. And Party's wife, Preeti, a number of times, I understand, said, these hooks are dangerous, Party. You gotta just take them off of there, somebody's gonna lose an eye or something. And Party, like many husbands, is like, yes, honey, I'll get to it. He never got to it. Well, actually, he did get to it at this point. Because as he's doing scrub, peek, as he looks away, this loofah hook goes into his eye. Like a hot knife through butter. And he finds himself like attached to this whole apparatus. So he pulls the springs and kind of just sits up like this, trying to figure out what to do. And of course, Amorous and Jay are screaming. And Amorous, wanting to help Daddy out, grabs the pole and starts yanking it. And Party can feel his eyeball, like, ooh. Now, fortunately, my man here is not only the amazing peacemaker you know and love today, he's also a former Milwaukee police officer, where he served in the 7th District for 5 years. So this guy's pretty cool under pressure. So as Amherst is yanking on this pole and his eye is hanging in the balance, he's like, very calmly, baby girl, you gotta let go of the hook. So she lets go, and he goes to the mirror, and he kind of takes it out the way he came in, and blood goes flying everywhere, and he takes a towel, and he's like covering up his eye. He's like, okay, at the time he lived 2 blocks from an urgent care, unfortunately, so he's, okay kids, get dressed, we're gonna go to urgent care. And he's walking to urgent care, holding his eye, Jay's in one arm, Amherst is on his other arm, and he's juggling the phone, and he's calling Preeti, and he's like, hey, honey, you're gonna say I told you so, but you know that hook? And she's like, oh, you idiot. So he comes walking in the urgent care, and right away they're like, nope, emergency room, this is beyond our capabilities here. And by that time, Preeti showed up, took him to Freighter, and the doctor at Freighter's like, Mr. Kalinga, you're a very lucky man. And he's like, I don't really feel lucky, doc. And the doctor says, well, had that hook been 2 millimeters the other way, you would have lost your eye. But as it was, it just went through the white of the eye, didn't damage any essential parts, but it did tear the muscle that controlled his upper eyelid, like allowing him to blink and keeping his eyelid up. So, I've learned one of the greatest blessings of my 11 years almost with Party now is just like getting to know Punjabis. Like I love Punjabis. Anywhere I go and I find Punjabis, like we're like, oh, awesome. And one of the things about Punjabis, not the stereotype, but like they make anything work. Like they're gonna find a way to get through anything. So if your eyelid won't stay open, you can use some tape to keep it open. And then you go about, then you work. You work. That's the thing, you gotta go and work. And so Party had this tape over his eye to keep his eyelid up. And he had to like manually blink because it would get dry sometimes. And he's telling me this whole story that I just told you when we first met. You heard the term like icebreaker? This is like the ice was shattered, it was like obliterated. And most importantly, just like every one of you, as I'm hearing the story, I'm like, oh, I'm like cringing as I hear all this gore about it. And in my case too, I'm a almost fatal klutz. Like I am far and away my own worst enemy. I have post-concussion syndrome. I've had over 20 concussions, and probably 10 of them have been self-inflicted. So to meet a guy who's like as clumsy as I am, I'm like, what has this guy done all my life? And so we just like, that was the beginning of our friendship, and it started in empathy. It started with me literally feeling his pain of this bizarre accident, which allowed us to sit down and talk, where I again, did my best to literally feel the pain of your faith community being attacked in this kind of atrocity, and your father being murdered. Not only murdered, but Party's father was the last person murdered that day. He died about as far away from a door as I am from that door, that he could have run out of at any time and saved his life. But the Gurdwara that morning was full of elderly people and children. It was before service. Those are the people who all showed up early. Many people were hiding in the basement, hiding in closets. And Slithorne fought off the gunman with a butter knife. It was the only weapon he could find. And he was shot 5 times before he fell. And that kind of bravery and dedication, again, if we're gonna ask ourselves like what it's gonna take to address the injustices that we see in society and to keep our society moving forward and towards a place where all people are valued and included, I think we can draw great inspiration from that type of, it's really martyrdom. And in Sikhi, that's a big factor of the religion. I believe most of the gurus, if not all of them?
No, not most of them.
Most of the gurus were martyred over the course of Sikhi's evolution. So Pradeep and I sat down and we talked about we did talk about the shooting a little bit. I kind of went in there like thinking, okay, I'm gonna have to provide this guy all these answers that he's gonna need, and I don't know if I'm gonna be able to. I was feeling kind of inadequate. we did talk about the shooting a little bit, but mostly we talked about our dads and our daughters. He had mentioned that Amaris was 7 at the time, and I was like, when my daughter was 7, this just came to my mind. I don't know, again, like some divine intervention thing here. For your guys' information, I'm the token Buddhist in the room, so I have sicky tattoos, but I'm not opposed to divine intervention at times. And something in my mind, like when he said Amaris was 7, I go, when my daughter was 7, she had this thing where it always happened when we were trying to get out the door. And so I put her shoes and socks on, and if the sock wasn't perfectly across her toes, the seam of the sock, if it was cocked one way or another, she'd just be like, not going anywhere. All right, so you gotta stop, take the shoes off, take the socks off, straighten them out, put the shoes back on. And I'm telling Party that story, and he's like, dude, my daughter does that. The exact same thing. And we're like, wow. And then we're talking about our dads. And to this day, one of my favorite aspects of our relationship is hearing Sutwan's stories. Like stories about Party's dad. He's just this indomitable guy. And he was telling me about his dad's personality. He's like, my dad was pretty handy. He was definitely a jack of all trades, master of none. There was some stuff he didn't know how to fix, but that never stopped him. Like, he was never going to pay someone to fix something that he could take a crack at. And this resulted one year to having the lawnmower apart on the living room carpet throughout the winter. And as he told me that, I'm like, dude, my dad did that. He had lawnmower parts on our living room carpet. Like, my mom freaked out. And so here we are, 2 boys who were born on opposite sides of the planet Earth. Party up in Punjab, India, me in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His family came here in the mid-'80s with $35 in their name, not speaking English, and literally worked and worked for 30 years to achieve what we know as the American dream. Nice house in the suburbs, 2 adult sons, both graduating from Marquette, first people in the family to ever have a college degree, a very thriving small business. And then the patriarch of the family is murdered in this horrific hate crime. I think that's sadly part of the American experience as well for way too many immigrants who come here. Looking at my life and thinking about the American dream, now, mind you, I was the poor kid in Mequon. Okay, so if you're from around here, you know Mequon. It's a bougie suburb on the North Shore, very well-to-do. And I was the poor kid in Mequon. But what that meant was, instead of going, I was always jealous of my friends when I was in school because they went to like Hawaii and Disneyland and like Europe for summer vacation. We just went up north of my dad's cabin. That's all rough. That's what being a poor kid in Mequon's like. But even as the poor kid in Mequon, like I had the American dream handed to me on a silver platter, and I was just like, this is what I think your American dream is. I not only like spurned it, I shunned it, and I spent really all of my teenage life just lashing out at the world around me, and it was because of alcoholism in our family. And not like, when I say my dad's an alcoholic, a lot of people are like, oh, dad was abusive, he beat him or he beat mom. My dad wasn't abusive, he wasn't a mean drunk. My dad, to this day, I say he's a fun drunk. Like when dad was drunk when I was a kid, and then we were gonna shoot guns in the basement and light fireworks off in the backyard. Party passed around and reminded me that's not normal. Like, most people don't do that, but to me that was normal, and that was my dad, and my dad loved me very much, but sometimes he drank more than he worked, and that put a lot of strain on my mom. And there were times where she was working 2 jobs to keep the lights on and the bills paid in our nice house in a nice neighborhood. We were living way beyond our means. And throughout my childhood, my mom was stressed out of her mind. I could see her suffering every day. Her relationship with my dad sucked. They would argue constantly, usually about money. And rather than be a good kid and be like, hey mom, I love you, how can I help? I started to distance myself from her and from my dad, who, despite his disease, did love me very much. And of course, that made my suffering worse. So I started lashing out at other kids. Hurt people is a really important theme and a tool actually that I use personally every day. And it's just reminding ourselves that hostility, hate, violence, it stems from suffering. And if we can acknowledge that and remind ourselves of that in any sort of conflict, it empowers us to respond to that suffering with compassion rather than aggression, which will only feed the suffering and create more of it. But compassion can extinguish and soothe that suffering and transform it into something really beautiful, actually. I was an example of that growing up. I went from a bully on the school bus to fights in the schoolyard, breaking and entering, vandalism. Started drinking myself when I was 14. When I was 16, I was a full-blown alcoholic. I had been violent since I was a little kid as a bully. Violence was very second nature to me. Hate was just another part of the rush. I had this like addiction to lashing out. I had an addiction for antisocial behavior. And it's interesting, Pardeep and I both work for a really brilliant organization called Parents for Peace nowadays. As interventionists, we work with families and individuals to help off-ramp from all sorts of violent extremism, not just white nationalism, but religious, political, what have you. And a big theme of Parents for Peace is that we treat hate as an addiction. Our executive director, Miriam Nadrick-Churchill, says that hate is their drug of choice. And I can attest to that hate is very much something that numbs you from trauma of your own that you're trying to avoid. And there are many people today who are using hate as a drug to flee from their trauma, to numb them from their responsibilities, from things that they have to do to improve their own lives. And of course, just like any other substance abuse, when you're using drugs, whatever you're doing is going to get worse. So hate can send you down this spiral very quickly that can destroy your life and other people's lives as well. I got involved with white power skinheads when I was 16 years old. I heard a song that told me that I was a white man fighting for my people, which is in danger of extinction at the hands of this Jewish genocide that's been going on for 2,000 years. And by the way, now this varies from white nationalist to white nationalist, but in my white nationalist sect, Christianity was like enemy number one. Christianity was a tool of the Jews to destroy the white race. Because what logical creature is going to turn the other cheek when they're hit or love their enemy? What suicidal advice would you give to people if you wanted to destroy them as a people? Now, I hope that sounds ridiculous to all of you. It did not sound ridiculous to 16-year-old Arnold. It was literally music to my ears. Mainly because it really pissed people off. It was so repulsive to civil society that I was like, let's do it. Like that. This was like going from like snorting cocaine to crack cocaine. It was like making this next leap in the intake of the drug that you need. And I needed that fix to repulse people, because that's just how I had established myself since I was a very young child. I was involved in white nationalism for 7 years. I was one of the founding members of the organization that Wade Michael Page, the man who killed Pardeep's dad, and 6 other people belonged to. Throughout that time, I had this growing sense of exhaustion, and the exhaustion came from all sorts of directions. But the biggest exhaustion was when people I claimed to hate treated me with kindness. And I was very fortunate that throughout my 7-year involvement in hate groups, there were people like a Jewish boss, a lesbian supervisor, Afro-American and Latino coworkers who treated me with kindness when I least deserved it, but when I needed it most. And that's what ultimately led me from hate groups. It brought me to a point where I was looking for an excuse to leave, and that excuse came in 1994. Early that year, my girlfriend and I broke up. Go figure, but hate and violence and alcohol is not a recipe for a successful relationship between a man and a woman. And I found myself a single parent to our 18-month-old daughter, aforementioned daughter who later had an issue with her socks. It is now 30 and is a brilliant young woman who my life still revolves around. And a couple months after her mom and I broke up, a second friend of mine was murdered in a street fight. And at that point, I had lost count of how many friends had been incarcerated. So it finally hit me that if I didn't change my ways, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter. And that's how I left hate groups in 1994. Now, when Pardeep and I met at that Thai restaurant, he did ask me that question: how can somebody walk into a place of worship on a beautiful sunny Sunday morning and start murdering people? And the other question he asked me is, what can we do about it? The answer to both of those questions is the same, and it's practice. So this is my Buddhism showing, but practice is a big deal for me spiritually. Like, Buddhism is all about practice. Your meditation is a practice. The way you think and the way you act, the way you see the world, everything you do is a practice. Practice shapes us as human beings. The repetition of practice takes things that were once uncomfortable and unfamiliar and makes them comfortable and familiar so that we can do them second nature. Now, if you're an NFL quarterback or something, or a concert pianist, it's practicing that art until you don't even think about it. It's just muscle memory. When you practice hate and violence, it destroys your life. It devastates you to the point where nothing but homicide followed by suicide can make sense. And Wade Michael Page had practiced hate and violence for over a decade before August 5th, 2012. That's what destroyed the humanity in him and brought him to that place. The answer to what we can do about it is also practice. Practicing kindness, practicing compassion, practicing forgiveness, practicing love. And I really believe that all human spirituality is a practice. As I said, certainly Buddhism is, certainly Sikhi is, the articles of faith in Sikhi, tying your turban every morning, wearing your gara, those are all practices. But as you all know, in Christianity and all the Abrahamic faiths, in Islam and Judaism, your faith is a practice as well. When you pray every day, when you minister to your congregations, when you just sit and listen to someone, you're practicing all of these things that Jesus taught us. You're practicing the truth that we are one. And I do believe that practice is where our salvation lies. I was diverted from ending up where Wade Page was by people who treated me with kindness when I hated them, when I did not deserve that kindness. And I sometimes wonder, like, how could those people do that? How could someone treat me kindly when I outright said I hated them? What's the answer? Practice. The more you practice kindness and it becomes second nature to you, the more powerful that kindness becomes, and the more able you are to roll out that kindness in the situations where it's most sorely needed. And so I want to thank all of you for sharing your practices with each other, with your congregations, with the world, and with us. And I'm very uplifted to be here with you today, because I know that together, as we all engage in our respective practices and we kind of pool our practices, we do have the power to overcome hate and violence in our society. So thank you all so much.
We're just going to take some questions in just a little bit, but I want to remind everybody, if we didn't bring any name or those business cards, but let's stay. I know most people are on LinkedIn now, so I'm under Pardeep Singh Kalika and Arnold Michaelis on LinkedIn.
Arnold Michaelis on LinkedIn, yeah.
Yep, and then if there's questions that we weren't able to answer, let's connect there, and let's stay connected as we go forward. But as Arnold put it, you know, one of the things that we truly believe in is obviously the first conversation that we had around courage, and having the courage to show up for a community, showing up for yourself, your congregations, empathy, right? Engaging in empathy, because that's sometimes the most sincere form of love. I can't be you and you can't be me, but our connection can be so deep that you understand somebody from the way that they're living their life and their existence, right? And then sometimes it goes into when we do racial justice work, when we're doing our other social justice work, is that, and Arnold and I have this discussion all the time, I can't live the life that he's lived. I can only learn from him. And for him to know my life, right, would be also kind of an academic exercise as well, but it can be more of a lived experience the more that you empathize. And finally, that courage to be committed to your faith, that courage to be committed to kindness, to practice those things, so much so that they become a commitment. Some of the most the scariest days of our lives were when we walked into the temple for the first time, and I saw the faces of youth, and those faces were just feeling like they don't belong in this country. And at that point, that we made a commitment to say no, like we have to do something about this. This is the most beautiful part of who we are. These youth are going to be our leaders tomorrow. So if they don't feel like they belong in the United States because a white supremacist came in here and murdered 7 people, right? We're not, the people of goodwill are not winning. So this was a battle, and over the past 10 years, we've been fighting this battle, and last year we commemorated the 10th anniversary of the Sikh temple shooting. And why we use the shooter's name, and you will notice that Arnold and I will use the shooter's name, because we want each and every person that's out there, and there are people out there that are going to be, and that want to do the next shooting, that want to see a community suffer, and they want to find the most intimate place to make that community suffer because they are hurting so bad, right? And so elementary schools, movie theaters, churches, synagogues, masjids, not them personally, but the spirit of evil that's inside of them wants to make you also lose hope in each other, right, and yourselves. So they will attack you at the most vulnerable part of it. And so we want to remind every wave page out there, this is exactly what happens. You will not be the one that gets remembered because you're trying to be remembered for your act of evil. So we have to be careful as a society not to glamorize the person, the perpetrator, and reclaim power. And the power needs to be reclaimed in healing, right? That practice of what we do. As a country, we have practiced power too long, and that practice of power has not always included healing. My daughter, who was 6 at the time when the shooting happened, was 16, she says to me at the 10th commemoration, "Hey Dad, I want to do a spoken word poem, and I want to address the shooter." And as a father, you don't know what your daughter's going through for the past 10 years. You just hope you're doing your best. Right? This is the same girl that tried to pull that hook out of my eye. So you just never know. So she gets up there and she delivers a beautiful spoken word where she ends off and she says to him, and on behalf of all the 8-year-olds and all the 9-year-olds, all the 6-year-olds that were inside the Gurdwara at that time, she ends off and says, "You didn't hate me, you hated yourself." And like, Arnold and I can go on and verbose, but in those words, she summarized the reclamation by an entire generation. And yeah, so I think that there's a lot of hope that we have going forward. It's an honor to be with you all today. I'm gonna jet as soon as the conversation's over, but I want to stay in touch. Arnold will stick around and have conversations, but I gotta get on the plane and get to Atlanta. But if there's some questions that you have.
We've got one online.
Perfect.
So much of the focus that we've been talking about the last few days has been around white supremacy. And in one of the small group discussions, there was conversation around a universal cultural sense of supremacy in each person's identity, regardless of where they came from in the world. And so the question is, how do we move past the us versus them and into a discussion of just us?
That's a great question. It's such a difficult conversation, but I think there needs to be ongoing, obviously, conversations, learning, education. We need to know, we need to see representation of all diverse faces. For me, growing up, I didn't see a lot of representation from people that look like me, so I think I adopted a culture And the adoption of the culture means you also adopt a culture of what it feels like to be powerful, or to feel represented, to feel like you have some kind of voice. And for many people, you will see right now that there's systemic white supremacy, and then there's individual, also white supremacist, nationalist, and other forms of ideological violence that people take on. Arno and I do work on both of them. A lot of times when we're working on the individual, there's a different methodology that we choose to take, right? And that methodology may be different for us to take on, to say, we need to reach the person who is suffering, and so we need to go to the depths of hell with them, right? So we can do that. But as a society, as we're thinking about systemic, or like what that all kind of feels like, power, and how people have felt for a long time, that's different. That's different, and that we need to address that by being sincere about the impacts that has had on us right now, the harm that it has, the way that we visualize, see it, and how we all adopt it. I hate to say it, but we all adopt a way of wanting to be powerful, right? We all want to have privilege. We all have some privilege in certain places. And as soon as we realize what our privilege is, privilege realizes, privilege utilized. And so the privilege denied is something that you kind of like, okay, well, you know what, I don't have it in this moment. I will have privilege in certain situations. I can open the door in certain ways. And somehow, some way, that may mean a sacrifice for me or somebody else. And so I think systemically, there needs to kind of be that addressing of what that all kind of looks like. And again, now we may be past the part of understanding. We may be at the part where we need to commit to action. And because the real world implications are having too big of an implication. I teach a class at UW Milwaukee, and a lot of times the students of color and the challenges that students are going through right now are unlike any other challenges that were faced before. And that's true for any generation. But this generation right now, we're seeing 8 billion plus people. We're seeing weapons of mass rejection happening, meaning that you're not only rejected at school, you're rejected online, sometimes you feel rejected at home, sometimes there's so much of that I think we need to weaponize. We need to, as we go forward and address white supremacy or any kind of power imbalance, we need to weaponize compassion.
I would add to that, whenever I think about white supremacy, like you have to have a grasp of it. It started 400 years ago, and human beings have been around for 200,000 years. So this is a relatively very new thing in human society, and the foundation of white supremacy is race. Race was concocted by racists in order to perpetrate racism. So I think it's really important to understand that race is part of the problem. It's not part of the solution. We do have to, as a society, acknowledge the massive suffering that race has caused and continues to cause for 400 years. We have not done that. We have not borne witness to the suffering that race has caused. Primarily people with melanin in their skin because of the color of their skin. But race is a cancer to society, and I believe as a former white nationalist, the more racialized our society is, the more of a racial lens we see the world through, the more conducive it is to white nationalism. White nationalists today are cleaning up because of the hyper-racialized tone of our rhetoric in society. And so I think it's really important to look at every single human being as a unique individual that has a divine aspect to them along with everybody else, and not see other people as a political abstraction, which race is. Race is simply an ideology. There's no scientific basis for it. It's a social construct. It's an ideology, and ideologies require human maintenance in order to continue. So we can't, unfortunately, just snap our fingers and be like, yay, race is over. That can't happen until we bear witness to the suffering that race has caused. So that bearing witness is a priority for me at this point, but doing so with an end game of truly realizing a society where we are judged by the content of our character and not by the color of our skin. So I think give a thought to that end game of where we're headed, rather than kind of shuffling deck chairs on the racial Titanic and being like, well, maybe if we make this race better and this race worse, then it'll even things out. I can't see a healthy future in which we see each other through a racial lens. That's my personal opinion. That's what I've learned on my journey in life, and especially over the past 13 years doing this work internationally. And most importantly, listening to all sorts of people, many of whom, if not most of whom, don't look like me. So it's important to have that sort of divine view of other human beings. I'm a big fan of Father Greg Boyle. He started a thing in LA called Homeboy Industries. If you're not familiar, just Google it, it's amazing. His first book, Tattoos on the Heart, begins with an anecdote about an adult man who's caring for his elderly father. And he's got a family, he's got a job, and he's stressed out, so he's another kid to care for, basically, and his dad. And he's trying to put his dad to bed every night. And every night his dad won't go to bed. Just like a little kid. His dad just stares at him. I cannot tell this story without getting choked up. His dad just stares at him. Finally one night the guy's like, Dad, will you please just go to bed? I'm exhausted. I can't take this. Why won't you just go to bed? And his dad goes, because I don't know if this is the last time I'm going to see you or not. And Father Greg tells that story like, those are the eyes of God. And that's how we need to see each other. And we can't see each other when when our lens is distorted by saying that some of your different, the amount of melanin you do or don't have in your skin makes you more different than alike than me. So really come from that truth that we're all human beings having a common human experience, and that's why racism is so wrong. That's why racism is unacceptable. That's why race is unacceptable, and that's why we all need to unite to fight against it. Very good.
At the end of every mass shooting that we experience in America, and we experience them almost instantaneously, like on CNN, there's always a cry for a ban on automatic assault weapons. Do you think a ban on assault weapons would do any good?
So, when the Second Amendment was passed, what types of guns did we have?
Muskets.
Yep. When the First Amendment was passed, what type of freedom, like what kind of speech did we have? Do we have digital forms of speech? No. So, fast forward, I mean, it used to take almost a week, 2 weeks to get a horse from here to there to deliver your letter, right? Mm-hmm. Fast forward to today. You have 8 billion people. You have a population in the United States that has exponentially grown. You have weapons of mass destruction, and you have communication of mass rejection. And you put all of that together, and you're going to have a mass shooting every single day that's been escalating for the past 5 years. I mean, it's kind of like a no-brainer at this point that if you cannot do something about all of that other stuff, that you have to reduce the harm that somebody can do when they're in moments of crisis. I am a mental health clinician. I work with Arnold, and we work with lots of individuals who are very isolated, very hateful, are taking in extreme content online, and some of this content that they're taking in is so disturbing to the peace of mind that even if you watched a little bit of it, you could not stomach it. I mean, we're talking about three-dimensional things that are coming out at you that are making people who are schizophrenic even more schizophrenic. And so this is the type of mass rejection. I'm not just talking about mass rejection. It's like, oh, you know what, I denied you, or I didn't want to go out with you. We're dealing with lots of severe symptoms of society and an increase. And you do not know where the next shooting is going to be. But you do have to reduce the amount of harm that one can do when they're in moments of crisis. If I'm concerned about somebody and I said, let's red flag them, I personally, if I have a client, I can call the police and say, hey, I want you to do a wellness check. So-and-so said that they want to harm other people and they have weapons in their house. Now, as a clinician, I could have that done. How come as a society, we don't have that same ability, right? And so I do think that we do have to get serious about gun laws. We have to, yes, we have to pass. We have to pass legislation that, and this is, again, like we see the most dire, darkest part of society, right? And I guarantee you, well, yes, we need to get serious about gun laws because somewhere, like somebody else is going to be impacted. And I say this not because it's funny, it's just because it's just logical. It's so logical. And I would even go, like, we need to get to a civil society where we can demilitarize ourselves.
Yeah.
A lot of this paranoia that exists within police relationships, right? Former cop, but a lot of the tension that exists is because people are scared of one another. They're fearful. As a cop, you're walking up to somebody, and the first thing you're doing is looking at their hands, not looking into their eyes. So how are you connecting? Right? As a society, we need to have a serious discussion about guns access, and get to a place where we can demilitarize.
Other questions? I could go on all day about gun control for sure, but I'm not. I guess my quick thought is that my dad is a gun nut. We shot guns in our basement. He's got enough guns now to take on, the Oregon State Police. But my dad always taught me to take guns very seriously. Like, guns are not toys. If you point a gun at something, you're going to kill it. My dad has buried in my head, take it seriously, take firearms seriously. I don't think we take firearms seriously as a society. I think, I told you it was going to be a short answer, but 11 years ago, I went with my daughter to adopt a cat from the Humane Society. At the same time, I went to buy myself a 12-gauge shotgun for home defense because I get death threats from my old buddies. Which process do you think I was scrutinized more in? I love animals, and when you're adopting an animal, like, you should be scrutinized. This is you're taking this life in your hands. But I seriously, I had like a 5-page application for the cat, numerous interviews to see if I was capable of taking care of a cat. Buying my gun was filling out a half-page form and picking it up 3 days later. So if our society scrutinizes people adopting animals more than people buying guns, I think that's an issue.
That's right.
The other concern about it is, and it does go past, semi-automatic rifles, and like we're getting into a place where we're seeing 3-dimensional guns and 3D printers that are able to print off guns in a few days now, that are not having mechanical parts, metal parts, that you're even going through metal detectors. It's just a matter of time, and those serial-less guns sometimes when you say 3-dimensional printer, people are like, oh, well, that must be a paper gun. No, this is a real firearm, a real gun that people are printing at home and making the parts out of it. And so there's no serial number, and those are starting to almost get to a place where they're gonna outnumber the amount of firearms that we have in this country. And this is what we're seeing. Intel is showing that a lot of this is happening within people who are very, very disturbed, who have a lot of time to have these. So we're going to have to do something about all that. I gotta run. My wife is out there like, we gotta get to the airport. Thank you so much. Let's connect on LinkedIn.
I'm not going to continue to answer your questions. I'm just saying no.
Thank you, Georges. Good night. next session is at 2:30. They're going to pull the air wall in between these two rooms. So if you're in that link between the third back there, there's going to come a wall that's going to come across. In here we have the seminar on prophetic witness. Over there we have, what is the one from Wisconsin Council of Churches?
Holy Imagination.
Thank you, from Carrie Parker, the director of the Wisconsin Council of Churches. So back in here at 2:30.
That's